Okay, good afternoon, morning, evening, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is James Pitcher. I'm the Program Director for our Distributed Futures Research Program at ZN Long Finance. I'll shortly be handing over to Maury Schenk, who's going to walk you through a summary of a fascinating report that we published in February of this year. As this is a short webinar, it will be listen only for participants, but there will be and is an opportunity for you to ask questions as you go, and we will respond to you directly afterwards. If you'd like to ask a question during the webinar, on the top right hand side of your screen you'll be able to see 4 symbols vertically placed. If you can't see them, please exit full screen mode. Click on the top one, the arrow, and that should reveal a small window where you can type any questions or comments. So here it's a short webinar, as I mentioned. Here's the program for what we're going to cover over the next half an hour. That's me. So James Pitcher, Program Director at ZN Group, and my email address should you need it. I'll refer to that briefly at the end. By way of background, ZN is the City of London's leading commercial think tank. Long Finance is the pro bono arm of ZN and has 4 major research programs: Metacommerce, Financial Centre Futures, the Eternal Coin, and this program, the Distributed Futures program. Our Distributed Futures program is an open source research program for smart ledgers and new technology, sponsored by Cardano Foundation. I'll provide a little more detail on Cardano and also the program at the end of the webinar when Maury has finished presenting. But just so you know, our research, if you're not already familiar, is structured around 4 themes: societal, technological, economical, and political, and is directed at 4 outcomes: expanding frontiers, changing systems, delivering services, and building communities. The Quantum Countdown report, of course, fits very much under the technological and potentially changing systems heading. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Maury, who's going to walk you through the rest of the slides.
Thank you very much, James, and to ZN for inviting me to speak today. I'll dive right into a summary of what we found in our report. This is the agenda for my presentation today and a good summary of our report. I will read it. Large-scale quantum computers would pose a serious threat to the security of public key cryptography. So, what should affected entities do and when? But while the issues can be stated briefly in this fashion, there's a lot of technical detail behind them. Explaining that detail at a high level is what I plan to do in the next 20 minutes or so, and there's a lot more detail in our report. The numbers in the circles on this slide indicate the order in which I'll unpack this summary, starting with an explanation of public key cryptography. So this on the left is a picture of the German Enigma machine used in World War II, and on the right is a bomb computer at Bletchley Park that was used to break Enigma, which was portrayed in the movie The Imitation Game. Enigma used symmetric cryptography, under which both the sender and the recipient use the same secret key. This posed some problems of key exchange and how to get the key from the sender to the recipient, or to both of them. There were at least 2 captures of Enigma key sheets on German vessels, a ship and a submarine, that were important to breaking Enigma. And anecdotally, I've been told that plane loads of key materials had to be transported around by the Allies during World War II. This was essentially the state of the art for cryptography until the 1970s. In the early 1970s, public key cryptography was invented at GCHQ here in the UK, although apparently never implemented in its initial form and not disclosed until decades later. But in 1976, Whitfield Diffie and Martin Hellman published a paper on a key exchange algorithm using public key cryptography. Up at the top left of this slide, it explains what this is. And what public key cryptography does is it uses public and private keys for each communication, avoiding the need for key exchange. It's based on certain mathematical problems that are hard in one direction and easier in the other, such as importantly, integer factorization. It's relatively easy to multiply two big numbers together, but harder to figure out what those two big prime numbers would be the case. Hard to figure out what the individual prime numbers are from the big number. In the smart ledger context, which is the focus of the distributed futures program, it's used for digital signature. To illustrate it, the diagram at the top right, it's like passing your public key is like passing out to everyone in the world an open lock that can be used to lock onto your message, and then only you can read it. So there are many of these open locks out there, they send it to you. And that's in the bottom chart, how it works for public key secure communication. The sender uses the recipient's public key. The recipient uses their own private key, and only they can read the message. For digital signature, which is what we care about in the smart ledger context, the sender uses their private key, and then the recipient uses the sender's public key to confirm the validity of the signature. This is a bit technical, but given time limitations, I will move on. There is more in the report. So, returning to our agenda, let's talk about quantum computers. I'll first explain briefly how quantum computers work, and then discuss what we mean by a large-scale quantum computer, that is, one powerful enough to cause problems for public key cryptography. There are two key phenomena that are relevant for quantum computing, two quantum phenomena. One is called superposition. A classical bit in a computer is either a 1 or a 0. A qubit, which is a bit of a quantum computer, can hold any value between 1 and 0, and it holds, contrary to common sense perhaps, all of those values at the same time. Entanglement is the other phenomena where more than one quantum bit or quantum particle can be entangled with another quantum particle and possibly at some distance. Here we have buildings in London or Paris, and it's possible for particles to be entangled over that distance. In a quantum computer, they're entangled over shorter distances. Now, these are strange phenomena. Einstein said on superposition, God does not play dice with the universe. On entanglement, he called entanglement spooky action at a distance. But the bulk of the scientific community now accepts that these quantum phenomena are real. Although some of them think that they have an underlying explanation in classical physics, and we interviewed some of those people in the context of this report. Overall, the consensus seems to be that quantum phenomena, though, are real. So if you link together multiple qubits through entanglement, you can explore simultaneously all of the states of any combination of the qubits. So for 10 qubits, which is about can explore about 1,000 states, 2 to the 10th power. And then that number grows very quickly. There's the fable of the chessboard, some of you may be familiar with, where a wise man asks, as a reward, asks the king for rice. 1 grain for the first square of the chessboard, twice as many grains on the second square, and so forth, twice as many grains on each square up to the 64. Well, it turns out that is about 18 quintillion grains of rice. It's about rice the size of Mount Everest, about 1,000 times the annual global rice production. And that's only the number of states with 64 qubits. The numbers that we will be talking about are greater. So quantum computers were first proposed in a speech by Nobel laureate Richard Feynman in 1981. And it took some time, though, to make any progress with actually building a quantum computer with entangled qubits. In 1998 was the first one with 2 entangled qubits. By 2011, we had gotten to 14. And at the time we launched this report early this year, the number was 49. It's now 72, where Google, it's mainly Google, and Intel is fast on their heels, have a quantum chip that has 72 qubits. These are physical qubits, the numbers above. So these are actual physical devices showing quantum effects. However, they don't show quantum effects for long. The current decoherence time, where the quantum effect falls apart, is about 90 microseconds, or 1/10,000th of a second. Logical qubits, which are like the bits in your traditional computer, don't exist yet. These would be stable computing devices. And to build a logical qubit, you would need a number of underlying physical qubits. We think about 10,000 or so with error correction. And it's estimated that 3,000 to 5,000 logical qubits are needed to attack current public key cryptography. So doing the math, we were talking 30 to 50 million logical qubits for current public key cryptography to be at risk. Currently, we're at 72, so there is some distance to go. So moving on to what does it mean? What is the serious threat that quantum computers pose to public key cryptography? So the quantum threat, and this is about new math, not the new math that became popular in the 1980s and 1990s, but really a revolutionary kind of math. The key algorithm, the key mathematical computation is called Shor's algorithm. It was discovered by a man called Shor in 1994 at Bell Laboratories. And the math works. If there were a sufficiently powerful quantum computer, Shor's algorithm would allow it to quickly solve the hard problems that underlie the most common public key algorithms, which include RSA, elliptic curve digital signature algorithm, and Diffie-Hellman. RSA, for example, is commonly used for securing web connections. ECDSA is the standard algorithm for blockchain signatures, including for Bitcoin. As we said on the previous slide, sufficiently powerful means about 3,000 to 5,000 logical qubits. It isn't entirely clear what problems quantum computers can solve or how big the set of problems they can solve is. And this Shor's algorithm was really one of the first that came along. It prompted a lot of the current interest in quantum computers where it proved that they could solve a practical problem, as in here breaking cryptography. There is another important algorithm for cryptography, much less of a threat than Shor's, but a significant one. It's called Grover's algorithm. It was discovered also at Bell Laboratories in 1996, and it provides a quadratic speedup for attacking symmetric cryptography and hash algorithms. A quadratic speedup means that something that takes x to the power of 2 time with a current computer would take x time with a quantum computer. And that seems like a pretty good speedup, but it's not as significant as the exponential and effectively instant speed up of solving hard problems that would be provided by Shor's algorithm. Hash algorithms are important for smart ledger and blockchain solutions, particularly the SHA-256 hash algorithm, which could be attacked by Grover's algorithm, is a commonly used algorithm. However, there are good alternatives to avoid these threats. And that's what we'll talk about now. But before we talk about what those alternatives should be, we'll talk about when they need to be addressed, and you'll see why that is. There's a guy called Michele Mosca, and he's kind of the guy in this field. He's a mathematics professor, cryptographer, and quantum computing expert at the University of Waterloo. He's the founder of Evolution Q, which is a firm that consults on this quantum computing problem. And he's formulated something called the Mosca Inequality, commonly called the Mosca Inequality, which defines whether you have a problem in terms of 3 quantities, x, y, and z. X is the desired duration of security of your system. Y is the time that you would require to replace cryptography in your system. And Z is the time to availability of large-scale quantum computing. So if X plus Y is less than Z, there is time yet to act and fix the problem. If X plus Y is greater than Z, it may already be too late to entirely avoid the post-quantum cryptography problem. And some systems may already fall into the second category. This is a particular issue for smart ledgers where X, the desired duration of security, can be very large because smart ledgers inherently involve a permanent immutable ledger, and so there may be desire for permanent security. there may be examples where it's quite safe, e-commerce applications, even where credit cards are stored, probably have a few years duration because credit cards have expiration dates and won't be a problem. And there are some intermediate cases, and we talk about some of these in our report. So the question is, what should affected entities do? Well, we have a couple of key recommendations. The first one is don't panic. In this slide, we've got Chicken Little on the left at the bottom. Chicken Little did panic. And the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy on the right, which recommends don't panic. There's a question whether this is like the Y2K problem that came along in the run-up to the year 2000. In a way, it's not. It has no certain deadline, as we explored on the previous slide. Maybe it's more like climate change because there is great uncertainty as to the timing and the impacts. And some skepticism whether it will happen at all. As I mentioned earlier, some people are skeptical whether large-scale quantum computers are possible at all. So there are good solutions that exist or are coming. In 2015, the European Union PQ Crypto project issued recommendations on which quantum algorithms, which cryptography algorithms called post-quantum cryptography can be used to replace existing algorithms for signature, for hash, and for secure communications purposes. And even more important than that, the US National Institute of Standards and Technology, often called NIST, is holding a competition that launched in 2016. The initial recommendations have, a number of competitors have submitted proposals in that competition. And the competition is expected to conclude by around 2022 with some recommendations on algorithms that are resistant to quantum computing and will handle these cryptography tasks, including public key signature and hash algorithms, which are needed for blockchain and digital signature. So there are a number of promising families of quantum resistant algorithms. I'm not going to go into the math behind them here. There's lattice computing, signature-based algorithms, code-based, which are based upon codes used for communication technology, multivariate, which uses systems of equations, and supersingular elliptic curve isogeny, which is a rather specific algorithm. These are summarized in our report. So, a program of action. What should a company do? This is the final recommendation of our report. And it basically suggests that this is how to think about if you have a system that could be vulnerable to quantum computing that uses currently vulnerable cryptography. Think about it in this way. Resource, have resources that understand the problem, because hopefully I've simplified it in a good way today, but it's a complicated problem, and understanding the right way to go requires understanding. Maybe that was circular, but in any event, it's important to have the right resources to understand both the crypto side of it and the computing side of it. Then monitor what's going on out there. In the quantum computing world, how fast are quantum computers advancing, and what solutions are out there in terms of post-quantum cryptography to provide an alternative to current cryptography. Then assess the quantum risks to your systems. And these two next steps, assess and plan, are really the heart of the problem. Figure out what in your system could be vulnerable to post-quantum, to quantum computing. And that will feed back into what resources you need and what you decide to monitor. Then plan a solution. So depending upon your identified risks, decide what you're going to do. And that that may be immediate action or it may be delayed action. You know, there are many people who say, don't need to jump now because we're still waiting for the NIST competition. Although if you have a super secure system that needs to be protected, now may be the time to jump. The National Security Agency, the US spy agency, has announced a couple of years ago that it's already starting its transition to quantum resistant solutions. And then finally, implement your planned solution on the chosen time frame. There's one obvious conclusion here about or a possibly obvious conclusion, there's a question mark after it, which we put there, that new systems should be quantum resistant to the start to avoid the risks associated with the quantum threat and the associated costs of re-engineering. This may not be the case in every case, but it's the quantum resistant solutions are out there, and to put it in at the outset shouldn't be too difficult. But many smart ledgers and other systems are not yet taking this approach, I think including because this threat is not yet widely known and because most familiar and off-the-shelf components are not quantum resistant. The Cardano project, which operates the ADA cryptocurrency, and this program of study, as James mentioned, is funded by the Cardano Foundation. The Cardano project has announced that they are working on a quantum resistant solution for their environment, for example. So that is the end of my presentation. I will pass it back to James. I think we'll probably end up with a few minutes to go. So if people want to put some questions in while James is talking, I might have a few minutes at the end to jump back in. But if not, as James said, we will answer your questions as follow-up.
Thank you, Maury, for that fascinating insight into potentially a very complex, area, and made that appear very simple for us. So thank you very much indeed. A reminder to everyone that the report and the full presentation slides are available on the Long Finance Disputed Features website. This was the first in a series of short and we hope informative webinars that will be running over the next 4 to 5 weeks. At each, we will provide a short summary of the reports that we have published this year. I'll touch on those again in a little more detail in a second under the Disputed Futures Research Program. From September onwards, we will run a webinar shortly after the publication of each new report, and you'll get a flavour for those topics that are coming up in a second. So again, as Maury said, there's a huge amount of supporting detail for the quantum report in the report, which is available on the website. Here are the covers of some of the reports that have already been released this year. You can see the quantum report on the top right. Others in the program that we'll be covering over the next 2 or 3 weeks include Get Smart About Scandals, Past Lessons for Future Finance. That sits in the societal heading. Liquidity or leakage, plumbing problems with cryptocurrencies, and the economic impact of smart ledgers on world trade, that sit under the economic heading. And timestamping of smart ledgers, and we will look at geostamping also, which fit under the technological heading as well. To get these reports into context, into the work program that we have coming up, this was, I say was, the timeline for the research and reporting that we put together a couple of months ago. I'm happy to inform you that this list has actually been extended by, I think, 4 or 5 since we even put this brochure out, which is again available on the website. And this will give you a really good flavour as to the opportunities around smart ledgers, but also the challenges that face us, and I very much hope that you'll subscribe to further webinars that will give you an idea of the scope of the program that you see here. In terms of next steps, we will answer any questions. Either Maury will attempt to do so if we have a couple of minutes at the end of this session. And if there aren't any, then please feel free to email me at james_pitcher@zn.com. As this was the inaugural webinar, we would also appreciate not just any questions, but if you have any feedback on this webinar itself and the content, and if it's been helpful to you or otherwise, so good, bad or ugly, we don't mind, please email me and I'd love to hear from you. These slides, which are an abbreviated version of the slides that were presented at the launch report, will be on the website later today or tomorrow, so please keep a lookout. And finally, before I hand back to Maury, I think we have one or two questions. If you would like more information, please visit the websites, that are on here and will be on the website imminently. So thank you again for dialing in. I'm going to hand you back briefly to Maury, who's going to answer a couple of questions that come in.
So I will answer the two questions that I've seen so far. If more come in with our remaining time, unfortunately, we will have to follow up on those separately. The first one, which I see is from my friend Heiner Langheim, is whether ZN will have some kind of countdown clock about, how the timing of the quantum risk. There was some discussion at the report launch that this report is one that naturally would involve some follow-up about, taking the temperature of the quantum risk as tech advances. And so I think that is on the calendar. It is at least being discussed. I don't think we're going to put up a clock, so to speak, but we have plans for follow-up at some point. This is, we think, a 15 to 20 year problem until it hits maybe 10 at the nearest. So we will follow up periodically. The second question was mentioning that, asking whether my comment about credit card follow-up, credit card not being a big risk, and asking whether this will remain the case as quantum computing advances. Well, taking the Mosca inequality, x plus y is less than z. I mean, as we get closer to quantum computing being a reality, then it could become more of a problem. I mean, credit cards generally don't have a validity of more than 3 or 4 years. So when we're only 3 or 4 years away from real attacks on standard cryptography, one would hope that the credit card companies would have become aware of this and the people processing credit cards. But inevitably, there may be some legacy systems. At this point, I think that there are many systems that are much higher risk than e-commerce and credit cards. So I will leave it with those two questions, and I believe with that we will end the webinar.